A few decades back, political scientist Cynthia Enloe was in the Philippines. She was trying to make sense of the international trade of M16 rifles when a colleague introduced her to this Levi's exec.
I have friends in the UK who look at women in the garment industry, about which I knew nothing, but I thought this would be my gift to her, that I would bring home some information from the Philippines. And I said, could I ever go through your factory? And she said, oh, sure, just don't wear Wranglers. I thought, well, I can manage that.
So Cynthia goes to the Levi's factory outside of Manila.
Of course, the first thing that strikes you is just wall-to-wall women sitting at sewing machines, but not doing the same thing.
Sewing a back pocket, for example, doesn't earn you as much money as a trickier side seam.
But what I did notice is that when we came to the big, clunky zipper machine, it was the one guy on the floor.
So she asks, does he get paid the same as the woman sewing the back pockets?
And the woman who was showing me around said, oh, no, this is a skilled job. I thought, oh, okay, I'm beginning to get it now.
She thought, okay, where are the other guys?
And the person said, oh, they're in the packing department and in the pressing department. I said, let me make a wild guess. Because although I wasn't yet a feminist analyst at all, I had looked at race and ethnicity around the world. And I said, let me guess, are packers and pressers also paid more than the women at the sewing machines? And they said yes.
It was the first time that Cynthia asked herself a question that would come to define feminist foreign policies around the world. Where are the women? But Cynthia wasn't asking where are the women at the top or even in the room where it happens.
I want to know where the women are in everything. Everything. In public education, in the cosmetic industry, in law firms. I want to know where women are in everything. And I am not just interested in the women who seem to have extraordinary influence. So my relationship to the question of feminist foreign policy is never to ask simply where are the women who make decisions or at least have some modicum of policy influence. I want to know where everyone is up and down the line. I want to have a gender analysis of an entire foreign affairs ministry.
But not just the foreign affairs ministry.
I became really interested in where all kinds of women, and not just women in the organizations, women who were wives, women who were prostitutes, women who did contract work, women who were the cleaners at night. I want to know all kinds of women because I realized that even powerful organizations depend on women's paid and unpaid work. And I didn't want that to be invisible because it makes the workings of formal organizations look as if they are much more simple than they are. And it looks as though power is only wielded at the top, but power is wielded at 9 o'clock at night when a woman comes in to clean the bathrooms. And I wanted all kinds of power that was gendered to be visible to all of us.
Today, that nuance has been lost in a sea of nuances around feminism and feminist foreign policy, leading to misunderstandings like so many that we've seen this season on Things That Go Boom. Misunderstandings like the sense among some that feminism is just about turning things around and subjugating men, or that a man could never be a feminist, let alone carry out a feminist foreign policy. On this episode of Things That Go Boom, where are the women, really? And where do we go from here?
Hi, I'm Tyler Foggett. Join me and my colleagues as we go beyond the headlines and deepen your understanding of the forces shaping our world today on The Political Scene, a newly updated podcast from The New Yorker. With episodes 3 times each week, The Political Scene accesses the sharpest minds in politics for insight and analysis about everything, from abortion rights to the war in Ukraine. Make sure you're following The Political Scene, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Garment shops might not seem like they have much to do with war. But what about bananas? Stick with me here because many of us probably eat our bananas without thinking too deeply about where they come from. Cynthia Enloe used to do the same.
I had bananas on my cereal, most mornings. And now all of a sudden I began to read the banana labels, which you can all do when you go to the grocery store, and see where the bananas that you're buying come from.
At that point, it was Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. And if you were in Asia,
your bananas probably are coming from the Philippines.
But it wasn't just about the bananas, because this was the 80s.
Turmoil in Central America. First there was Nicaragua, then El Salvador, now comes Guatemala.
In recent years, Guatemala has witnessed scores of massacres. The present government says it's trying to introduce reforms and is seeking foreign, in particular American, approval.
Central America is America. It's at our doorstep, and it's become the stage for a bold attempt by the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Nicaragua to install communism by force throughout the hemisphere.
And it was during the Reagan era, and it was the civil wars, plural, in Central America. And, the notion of the banana republic. But the banana republic, which is a country whose leaders have allowed themselves to simply be the flunkies of a more powerful, usually Western, but not always, a more powerful outside state, and to do their bidding.
1,000 miles south of New Orleans, the blue waters of the Caribbean break upon the shores of Central America. For many years, these fascinating tropical countries have been served by United Fruit Company's Great White Fleet.
The term Banana Republic itself, it was coined during the development of banana plantations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
And if you were a banana republic, it usually meant that you were in the pocket of not only United Fruit, which is now called Chiquita, but also in the United States, which was an ally of Chiquita.
Chiquita was owned by Americans. And so while many Latin American economies depended on the company's existence, its primary beneficiary was still the U.S. And so the derogatory term Banana Republic came to be, and to grow in use to the point that, somebody actually even named a clothing company after the concept.
But nobody, Lacey, and I was hanging out with lots of people who use the term Banana Republic, nobody seemed to be at all interested whether it was mainly men who were on the banana plantations. Was it mainly men who ran the company? Was it mainly men who were the flunkies? Was it mainly men in the executive offices of United Fruit, now Chiquita? Nobody seemed to be curious about that and to ask whether it mattered.
The answer was yes. It was mainly men in the executive office. And on the plantation itself, well, banana execs and pretty much everyone else, they just assumed that those dirty physical jobs were jobs for men. There were a few women, but they were usually in the washing sheds.
And washing sheds sounds pretty harmless as a job site. But in fact, the washing that is done on bananas is highly chemicalized. So it was a very dangerous job with a lot of health risks. And that's where the women were.
They were also outside the plantations.
There were oftentimes prostitutes around the plantations. And I wanted to know about them. I wanted to know, which women were in those prostituted jobs and what did they think they were doing? And how did they relate to the women in the washing sheds? I wanted to know everything, to tell you the truth. I was very greedy.
In her greed, Cynthia soon realized that women were central not just to the operation of these plantations, sustained by the labor of not just women in the wash sheds and prostitutes, but also the mothers and wives at home. Women were also central to the very success of the banana industry itself. Because while the U.S. is the largest importer of bananas today, that hasn't always been the case. After all that the U.S. got up to at the turn of the century in Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, the Philippines, Hawaii, the world started to grow a little bit tired of all of that U.S. imperialism. And Franklin Roosevelt decided it was time for a PR campaign.
In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor.
His good neighbor policy promised a more, quote, cooperative relationship with Latin America. It was just what America needed for its image, but also to pull itself out of the Depression, because more friendly relations with those countries would also make them a little bit easier to exploit. American corporations really loved this idea. In fact, they were so on board with this whole good neighbor campaign that in 1943, the United Fruit Company went so far as to open a Middle American Information Bureau. Its purpose was to promote the value of Central American products like hardwoods and fruit, along with their value to the war effort.
So next time you serve bananas, you'll have perhaps a keener appreciation of the many hands that have labored to make this delicacy America's most popular tropical fruit.
The campaign targeted school children and housewives, the folks who ate bananas and the folks who bought them. And it gave birth to the iconic Chiquita banana ad.
I'm Chiquita Banana, and I've come to say bananas have to ripen in a certain way.
Styled after the beautiful, very feminine Carmen Miranda with the bananas on her head.
Bananas are a solid food that doctors now include in baby's diet. And since they are so good for baby, I think we all should try it. Oh! See.
And wow, did it work. Thanks in part to Chiquita Banana, Americans had a new favorite Chiquita-branded food, and American interests in Latin America, they had a friendlier face. Today, Cynthia points out that virtually every affluent country in the world imports bananas. And those countries, they generally import those bananas from poor agrarian countries. Latin America accounts for the largest share of those exports, where American companies still reign. But while women became a driving force behind this major engine of society, they were still largely excluded from positions of power.
It increased the profits of the company, but it also excluded women from the then, in the 1980s, very vibrant banana worker unions that were becoming, really a challenge to the corporate control. And oftentimes, the union leaders claimed that they were the spokespeople for national dignity. They would not be a banana republic. They would stand up for their rights. Well, I thought, if women are working on the plantations, are they in the union leadership? Nope.
Cynthia says that this same dynamic plays out across the spectrum of our relations with the rest of the world. In other words, when we emphasize men's leadership and traditional male roles, we're also emphasizing corporate influence. This doesn't just minimize women, it minimizes the individual. The concept behind the Banana Republic, it was an early example of the dangerous role that some major corporations still play in countries around the world.
Tonight, Nestle under fire, accused of adding sugar to its infant products in middle and low-income countries.
Several investigations in 2018 found that a lot of the horrors of that genocide, the hateful language, the calls for violence, were promoted on Facebook.
Well, you may have heard of Shein. It is an online fast fashion brand.
But the industry is under scrutiny for poor working conditions and using cheap textiles that end up in landfills after only a few wears.
These gender dynamics are the same dynamics that lead some in more traditional foreign policy roles to place the needs of the state over the needs of the people within. And they're too often ignored or misunderstood. They play out in the streets, in the back rooms of garment shops, and on the fields of banana plantations. And they can lead to vast human suffering and inequality, and even to war. After the break, what happens when women take back the control? Way back in 2014, Russian President Vladimir Putin fired the first shots in the war that still rages today in Ukraine.
Russia's parliament today upped the ante in Moscow's face-off with Kiev.
On February 27th, unmarked Russian special forces seized a number of sites across the Crimean Peninsula.
Growing large groups of pro-Russia troops surrounding Ukrainian bases, ordering their forces off of them so they can occupy them. The international warning to Russia to end its invasion is being ignored.
These are the scenes that triggered the breakup of Ukraine. Unarmed protesters gunned down in the streets by the riot police who were retreating.
As Russian troops occupied Crimea's parliament, it dismissed the Crimean government, installed a pro-Russian government, and announced a referendum, which, according to those Russian-installed authorities, came out in favor of joining Russia.
As many as 95.5% of the electorate in Crimea have voted to join Russia. We are going back home. Crimea is in Russia. Hooray, comrades.
Pro-Russian separatist forces also took control of parts of the Donbass, where fighting continues today. It was in the wake of that invasion and annexation that Cynthia was first invited to visit Ukraine.
One of the things I can remember, we sat in a circle. It was that kind of meeting. We sat in a circle. It was a good feminist meeting. There were about 25 of us, mostly Ukraine, a couple of Swedes, a couple of Brits, myself.
As they went around the circle, there were these three women.
Three, mind you. This is what feminist activism looks like. Three women had created an organization in the now war zone of Donbass.
They were trying to help elderly women get to doctor's appointments, and it's no easy feat.
First of all, when so many of the doctors had fled because of the violence, but also because of all the checkpoints. And if you're a feminist doing feminist work in Donbass, you have to know how either to avoid militarized checkpoints or get through them so that the woman you're trying to help can get to her doctor.
It changed Cynthia's whole understanding of war.
That has stuck in my head for all these years, because I think that's what feminist work looks like in a war zone. Getting an elderly woman to her doctor's appointment in the midst of aerial bombardments, ground operations, and checkpoints. Checkpoints are very scary for women. Nobody is scrutinizing, and it's always men who are, if you will, manning, staffing the checkpoint. So checkpoints are very, very dangerous, and they're especially dangerous for women.
Cynthia writes that often when we think about women in war, we think of them as part of a single word: women and children. Women and children become our reason for going and our reason for staying. But we don't often think about how the condition of women inside a country might actually impact that whole country's resilience if war does break out.
And in Ukraine, this is really important. I believe the figure is that 51% of Ukrainian women by 2022 had paid work. That means they were more likely to have their own income. And that allows you to make some decisions about fleeing or about moving house or about protecting your kids that you can't make when the only income coming into the household is coming from the male member of the household.
When Russia invaded, some women chose to leave the country, and others chose to stay and help in other ways. These women weren't just cogs in the machine of war. They were able to choose to become real participants.
What I really want to know is, from their vantage point, what most stresses them out, what most scares them, what most increases their workload. So, for instance, one of the women I've been in touch with is named Marta Chumalo. And Marta is a leader of a women's feminist group, feminist advocacy group in the city of Lviv.
Lviv seems to have been the main target. Yeah, Ukraine claims there's been a massive wave again of missile and mainly drone attacks.
Entire apartments blown to bits in the night by a Russian missile attack.
The war is getting closer and people are getting ready.
And what Marta and her colleagues have worked on is violence against women in Ukraine, domestic violence and non-domestic violence. And the thing is, what do you do that when the missiles start falling? Well, what they say is you keep doing it. You don't pretend that domestic violence, which you have worked so hard to prevent or to find some reckoning for before the war started, you don't give it up because there's a war on. That's one of the things I've really had to learn from feminists in war zone, is that there are multiple layers of violence, that intimate violence and interstate violence are not at odds with each other. They can go on at the same time. And if you're a feminist, you don't simply become overwhelmed with patriotism and nationalism and then think, well, we'll take care of, we'll address, we'll work against domestic violence when the war's over.
And even in the middle of war, those multiple layers of violence still require a solution.
That's what patriots, in quotes, that's what patriots advise local feminists. Not now, later. But local feminists say, no, if we are fighting to defend this nation, it's got to be a nation worth making all these sacrifices for. It cannot be a patriarchal nation. It cannot be a nation that looks the other way when women are abused by their partners. That's not the nation we're fighting for.
Feminist war isn't just about winning. It's about building something better. And that progress can't wait.
It's very hard, but we all have to get together and have these very hard conversations and think about violence, about conscription, about protection, about negotiation, about violence against women in all sectors. We have to think about it, not later, but now.
And that thinking is hard, because we live in a world where men are socialized to talk about guns, but not wounds, and bombs, but not what they do to a body. And when the war effort takes priority over everything else, we risk losing sight of what really makes people safe.
I always ask my colleagues this: who do you want to be most be taken seriously by? And that really gives a lot away. And I think once somebody, man or woman, wants to be taken seriously in a government's foreign policy circles, which is both in government and out of government, then one becomes very nervous about one's credibility in the eyes of people who are much more conventional about security, about military budgets, about militarized deterrence. And if those are the people you're trying desperately to be taken seriously by, you don't want to say anything that will make you seem non-credible. And that means that you start talking about alternatives to military power.
But even Cynthia Enloe will admit she's still learning.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about militarized thinking. I mean, I can hear it. I can see it in the nooks and crannies. I've spent a lot of time kind of paying attention to flyovers over homecoming games of jet fighters over, the state university football field. So I've really thought a lot about militarism, but I don't know if I'm really skilled enough yet. I'm not, clearly, to really talk about the alternatives.
But that doesn't mean she's not working on it.
I had a group of students mainly from Mozambique, Malawi, Kenya, and Uganda. They were all mid-level civil servants from these countries. They were terrific. And I wrote on the board militarized ideas.
They imagined a series of entirely new axioms. Things like the world is a cooperative place, guns make us vulnerable, and patriots work at battered women's shelters.
But it does take practice to think, and this comes back to who you want to be taken seriously by. Not think I'm being naive, to not think I'm being simple-minded, to not think I'm just being fantastical, to actually say cooperation is a more powerful deterrent than is a more lethal weapon system.
And not just to say it, but to believe it. Next time on Things That Go Boom.
I feel like sometimes I'm shouting into the void in both spaces about the Indigenous rights movement. Like, we got to care about foreign policy, but not just as it applies to us and treaty rights, but as it applies to everyone. And then in other places, like, we need more Indigenous voices here, not just because we're cool, but because we have our own expertise to offer.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. If you like what we do, you can feel free to leave us a nice review on your favorite podcast platform anytime, or pop on over to our socials at Inkstick Media and say hi. This episode was produced by Robin Lynn and edited by Nikki Galtland. The music for our show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise is our engineer. Thanks, as always, to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible: the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Rich in minerals and vitamins, this great American fruit is a familiar commodity in the markets of the world. A breakfast, it is a favorite fruit in every home. For dessert, Mother introduces banana gingerbread shortcake, another of the many tempting ways in which this nutritious fruit can be prepared.
From PRX.